I've told many people, looking for a job is conceptually very easy. And it is true, conceptually it's very easy. The devil is in the detail. It's like the practice. So in order to find a job, and actually more generally to manage your career, there are 4 fundamental questions you need to answer. Now, the questions are simple. It's finding the answer that is not easy. The first question is this one. What problem are you good at solving? This is a major point because I find most immigrants have a very hard time answering that question. If you ask the average immigrant, what problem are you good at solving? You get quite often silence. Or I've heard people say, well, my organization didn't have any problem. Or people will say, well, I'm an engineer. Yeah, all of the, yeah. So I can solve any technical problem. So people will not be specific. But it is very important in my experience to learn to answer that question in a specific manner. Why is that? Well, we quite often use the word employer. I find that word is a misnomer. Organizations are not in the business of employing people. That's not their reason for being. What is their reason for being? Well, if they're a for-profit corporation, profit is their reason for being. If they're government, it's servicing people, and so on and so forth. No organization is in the business of employing people. It's a byproduct. Their goal is something else. And why is that so important? Well, quite often, so if I take the example of corporations, the reason an organization will hire somebody is fundamentally because they have a problem, and solving that problem requires hiring somebody who's good at solving that kind of problem. If the solution to that problem was hiring software, they would buy software. If the solution was buying a machine, they would buy a machine. So that begs a fundamental question: what problem are your clients good at solving? And that, in my experience, very few immigrants are able to answer that question in a way that meets the expectations of the average Canadian recruiter. But it is really critical for them to do that. We're going to come back to how do you do that later on, but it is really critical for people to do that. So once you've defined what problem you're good at solving, well, the logical next step is who has that problem and is willing to spend money to have it solved. You'll notice there's 2 parts to the question. They need to have the problem, but they also the problem needs to be acute enough that they will want to solve it and spend money on it. If they have the problem, but they're not willing to spend money, you have a hobby, not a job. And I'm sure your clients want a job, not a hobby. They want to be paid for it. There's a big difference there. The next question is usually the question everybody thinks of. How do you make them know you exist? They cannot hire you if they don't know you exist. That's obvious. This is when we send resumes. Yeah. This is when we network. Yeah. Oh, people will think of sending resumes, no problem. But if you haven't done this part first, you will probably be spinning your wheel. Like the odds of you being successful at that stage will be a lot lower, because you'll be sending the wrong kind of resume to the wrong kind of people. Doing this analysis, and I'll show you, I'll give you tools for that, but my experience is, particularly when you have a high level of formal education and quite a bit of experience, can take weeks. But I find that doing that work will increase the probability of getting the kind of job the person is qualified for way more than going straight to sending resumes. There's one more point, which is really important. Another question that plays a big role. It's this one. How do you convince people that you are the best at solving that problem for them. Because every job in Canada is a competition. You will be competing with other people. So you need to convince people that you are the best at solving the problem. That one can be a major challenge for a number of immigrants. Why is that? Well, in every culture, there is a line between self-promotion and boasting. The trouble is that that line is not the same for every culture. And so you may be self-promoting by one country's culture and be perceived as boasting by another, or not self-promoting at all by a third one. So Americans, for example, who come to Canada run into that problem quite often, because what is considered as self-promotion by American standards often comes across as boasting by Canadian standards. Americans will tell you, I'm the best. Now, in order to make sure that they're the best, they will restrict the range that they're discussing. So kind of, if you narrow it enough, you will be the best. Okay? And that's exactly what many Americans will do. I'm not like that. That's the way they communicate how good they are. So, for example, I remember I realized this point when I was in, I think it was Busch Garden in Orlando, Florida. Like, there was a sign that says something like, "This roller coaster is the biggest roller coaster in the southeastern United States." Well, if they said southeastern United States, what does that mean? There's a bigger one either in the western or northern part of the country. That's what it means. Everybody with me on this? Okay. And some will, like for example, like it's in New Orleans, they have a revolving restaurant, you know, like at the Calgary Tower. And they say it's the largest one. It's not the tallest one. There's a taller one somewhere else. But there's a larger one. The rotating part is the biggest one. So that's the way Americans will tackle it. They will find one way in which they're the best. Yeah? If you say you're the best in Canada, what kind of reaction do you get? Wait a minute. It's like, that is boasting by Canadian standards. So people will have to learn to do it in a different, Americans who come to Canada will have to learn to do it in a different way. People will run into a lot of immigrants will run into a lot of difficulties in that, dealing with that question, are people who come, for example, from East Asia. China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, countries like that. Okay. Countries where it is the line where between self-promotion and boasting is in a very different position. So, I mean, it's really hard for Chinese people to say, I'm good at something. That goes against the culture. I mean, I remember being in Beijing and asking a group of students to tell me, what are they good at? They couldn't do the exercise. They changed it into telling me what their neighbor was good at. And they went around the class and everybody was saying, oh, that person is good at this. And then it just kept going like this. But nobody said, I'm good at this. And what happens? Well, many Chinese people in job interviews will downplay their accomplishments. How does that come across to the average Canadian recruiter? They're not good. They're not the person we're looking for. When in fact, they may be the world's expert, but they will never say that. So, is everybody with me on this? These questions, I mean, as you can see, the questions are very simple. It's finding the answer that takes quite a bit of work. And it is important to do that work. Because otherwise, your chances of getting a job that makes use of your education and experience are much lower than if you don't. So, let's go, now we're going to get into, to me, the biggest challenge. Coming from hierarchical cultures, where the percentage of people who have a bachelor or more of education is limited, much smaller, we end up in a situation like this. We will describe our experience as broad. We will describe ourselves as generalists. If you look at the resume of most immigrants, it tries to communicate the fact that I can do everything. But what do Canadians hear when you tell them I can do everything?
I'm good at nothing.
Exactly. You cannot do anything well. So people will be told, or they will hear, jack of all trades, master of none. Because that's fundamentally the way Canadians will describe it. Canada is a land of specialists. People will describe themselves as specialists. So why is being a journalist so emphasized in the home countries of immigrants, and why is Canada such a specialized country? So remember we said the percentage of people who have a bachelor's or more is 4% globally. So what ends up happening very often is that in the home countries of immigrants, there's only a few people a small percentage of the population that has that level of education. As a result, when you work for an organization there, quite often there's a hole that appears in the organization, and people will be moved from one place to another within the organization because there's only so many people who have that level of education, so we're going to plug the hole by simply moving somebody from one area to another. So people like if you have a bachelor's or more of education in many of the home countries of immigrants, you will end up doing lots of things which in Canada would be considered as separate jobs. You'll be transferred from one area to another very, very quickly. And you will need to learn new areas very quickly. So what happens? People will say, I can learn. I'm sure you've all heard that. Mm-hmm. Well, Canadians will go, well, yeah, you may be able to learn, but I don't care. I can find someone who already knows. Because we have such a higher percentage of people who already have that degree. So there, the ability to learn is critical. Here, well, I want you to know already. The other thing, so I'll take an example. I remember this one lady from South Africa. She was in HR. In 2 years, she had worked in 6 different areas of human resources. Compensation and benefits, compensation, pension and benefit, learning and development, succession planning, organization effectiveness, I can't remember the other one, recruitment and selection. She had worked in 6 different areas of HR, which in Canada would be like you will do one for 3 years. So it's a really big challenge to start thinking of yourself as a specialist. And in the case of students, it's what specialization do I want to have by the time I graduate? Because I'm sure you've seen, many foreign students will take a wide range of courses with the idea that, well, that will help me get a job when I graduate. It will help you get a job when you graduate back home. It will not work in Canada. And so for many foreign students, one critical question when they arrive is, will I go home when I graduate or will I stay in Canada? Because the way you study, the way you structure your studies needs to be different depending on whether you go home at the end of your degree or you stay in Canada. So back home, people will even when they have a specialization, will try to describe their experience as broad. We'll come back to that point in a minute. Why is Canada such a country of specialists? Why is specialization so important to Canadians? So there's 2 aspects to it. One is, let's call it economic development for lack of a better word. Fundamentally, as the economy becomes more and more complex, you have more and more types of jobs. Think about, the economy 500 years ago. What kind of jobs did people have? Farmers, bakers. I mean, you could probably count those jobs on 2 hands. Today, there's so many different jobs that we don't even know all of them because the economy has become so much more complex. And so part of it is just the economy becoming more complex. But there's one more thing, which is specific to Canada. Because I've worked in Italy, I've worked in Germany, I've worked in France, I've worked in the US, and I can tell you, yes, these are countries also, specialization exists there, but not nearly to the same extent as in Canada. So the part that is specific to Canada is our geographic location. We are right next door to the biggest economy in the world. It may not always be the biggest economy in the world. China will probably surpass it at some point, but it will still be right next door. That will not change. And what it means is this. when a Canadian organization, a corporation, grows beyond a certain size, it will end up competing with an American company at some point. We will never win on price. We will never be the low-cost producer of anything unless it's like canola or iron ore, things we take off the ground. That we can produce cheap. But anytime there is processing involved, we lose. We cannot compete with China, Vietnam, or Bangladesh because our salaries are way too high. And we cannot compete with the US or other like Western European nations because our distribution costs are so much higher than theirs. Our domestic market is so much smaller than theirs. So the only way we can win is niche marketing. If you look at the website of just about any Canadian company, in the first paragraph, and usually the first 3 words, you will see these words. We specialize in. Canadian companies think of themselves as niche. So if the company specializes, what kind of employees do you think it's looking for? Specialists. Think about, for example, family doctors. What are family doctors called in the United Kingdom? Anybody knows?
I think they're called GP.
Yes. Do you know what GP stands for? Exactly. So they will describe themselves as generalists. Canadian family doctors do not describe themselves as generalists. What they will say is they specialize in family medicine. In other words, they specialize in being generalists. Because that's what family medicine is about. Okay? But they think of themselves as specialists. So the challenge for just about every immigrant or every foreign student I've worked with is making the mental shift. Going from thinking of yourself as a generalist to going to think of yourself as a specialist. And obviously that requires a very important step, defining your specialization. Because some people, because they've worked on many different areas, can genuinely claim several specializations. So then the question becomes, well, which one are they going to put forward? We'll come back to that question. But let me give you an example. It was really striking. So here I've changed the order of the slides a little bit. That slide is further down in the presentation, and we'll come back. So one of the people I've worked with was a guy named Tamazb. He was from Iran. When I met Tamazb, I asked him, what do you do? And he told me, I'm a civil engineer, I can build anything. Now, what does the average Canadian engineer think when people tell them, I can build anything? That doesn't make sense. So the word they'll use is bullshit, if you'll excuse my language for a second. Okay. So I asked Tamazb, well, how many years of experience do you have? He said 25, quite a bit. Then I asked him, well, what have you built? So he told me, well, I've built bridges, roads, tunnels, high-rise, dams. Now, think about the range of work that a civil engineer can do. He has covered quite a bit, right? So, all right, I told him, okay, but let's go into the details. How much time did you spend on each category specifically? Now, with Tamazb, it took a little bit of work because, for example, at one point he had built a road in the mountains. Now, if you build a road in the mountains, what happens? Well, you're going to have bridges and you have tunnels. So, it was all kind of, mixed together. But after a little bit of work, we ended up with a picture like this. 1 year on each of bridges, roads, tunnels, 2 years on high-rises, 20 years on dams. Think about the Canadian engineer with the exact same experience. How would they define themselves?
They'd probably say I'm a structural engineer specializing in...
Yeah, so, well, they'll say a dam engineer, if you excuse the pun. Yeah. And actually, specializing in dam is too broad, as you say. You're absolutely right.
Hydro or something maybe?
Yeah, a dam is so complex, people specialize in sub-parts of the dam. Some people will specialize in the foundation, some people specialize in the concrete, some people specialize in the water management, some people specialize in the power generation, and so on. We went a little further, and it turned out Tamasp, during the last 12 years in Iran, had done one thing, and one thing only. He was retrofitting the instrumentation and monitoring systems of existing dams. Now, probably many of you have no idea what I'm talking about, and that doesn't matter. The part that you all understand very clearly is he had a specialization. But he was still describing his experience as broad. I can do everything. Why? Because in Iran, that's what would get him the job. But here, what happens? Well, that's the wrong thing to do by Canadian standards. You need to define yourself as a specialist. And in the case of Tamasp, once he's starting to define himself as a specialist, he got a job at Manitoba Hydro. Guess what job he got at Manitoba Hydro? Retrofitting the instrumentation and monitoring systems of existing dams. This is the fundamental point. One of the key reasons it is so important, in my experience, to learn to think like a specialist is that, yes, the number of jobs for which you will be qualified will shrink significantly. But the probability of getting one of those jobs increases so much that you will actually have a higher chance of getting a job that way. Because if you apply to lots of jobs, what happens? The probability of getting any one of these jobs will be very, very low. Actually, in many cases, it will be completely zero. You have no chance whatsoever. You're just wasting your time. Whereas if you target jobs where there's really a high level of match between your experience, education, qualifications, skills, and the job requirements, then there's going to be a small number of jobs like that, but the odds of getting one of those jobs is much, much higher. To the point that that's the fastest way to get a job.